The pepper spray hit Naomi Okafor's face like liquid fire, burning through her consciousness as screams erupted around the Westfield Public Library. Her laptop crashed to the floor, the screen spiderwebbing across her half-finished history project about civil rights leaders. She couldn't hear the chaos, but she could feel it vibrating through her bones. See it in the horrified faces of library patrons backing away from the scene. 15 minutes earlier, Naomi had been completely absorbed in her research. Earbuds removed so she could read the captions on a documentary about Rosa Parks. The fluorescent lights hummed above her chosen workstation in the corner, where she always sat because the angle gave her a clear view of anyone approaching. Being deaf since birth had taught her to rely on her eyes. And today, they had failed her in the most catastrophic way. She had been typing steadily, fingers dancing across the keyboard as she crafted her senior project thesis. The assignment was Ambitious Trace, the evolution of peaceful resistance from the 1960s to modern day. Naomi found the topic deeply personal. As a young black woman navigating a world that often seemed designed to silence voices like hers, she understood the power of standing up without being able to speak out in the traditional sense. The afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the worn carpet. Children's laughter drifted from the picture book section, though Naomi experienced it only as fleeting movements in her peripheral vision. She was accustomed to the library's rhythm, the way people moved through the space with purpose or wandered aimlessly between shelves. When the two police officers first approached her workstation, Naomi didn't notice them immediately. Officer Derek Hartley and Officer Marcus Webb had been called in on what they'd been told was a disruptive patron situation. Someone had complained about a teenager monopolizing a computer station during peak hours, refusing to give up her spot despite multiple requests from other patrons. "Excuse me, miss," Officer Hartley said, his voice carrying the authoritative tone he'd perfected over 8 years on the force. He was a thick-set man with close-cropped gray hair and the kind of weathered face that suggested he'd seen too much of the world's ugliness. "We need you to wrap up whatever you're doing and move along." Naomi continued typing, completely unaware of his presence. Her project was due the next morning, and she was finally hitting her stride with a particularly complex paragraph about the intersection of disability rights and racial justice movements. The irony would later prove devastating. Officer Webb, younger and more impatient than his partner, stepped closer to the desk. "Hey, I'm talking to you," he said louder, his hand moving instinctively toward his utility belt. He had been on the force for only 3 years, but had already developed a reputation for escalating situations unnecessarily. "Don't ignore us." Still, Naomi typed on, lost in her research. She was reading about Haben Girma, the first deaf-blind graduate of Harvard Law School, and felt inspired to push harder on her own academic goals. College applications were due soon, and this project could make the difference between acceptance and rejection from her dream school. "That's it," Hartley muttered, his patience evaporating. In his experience, teenagers who ignored police commands were either high on something or deliberately defiant. Either way, the situation needed to be controlled quickly. "She's being non-compliant, probably on drugs, or just another entitled kid thinking she's above the law." The first physical contact came when Officer Webb grabbed Naomi's shoulder. She jumped, spinning around in her chair with wide eyes that immediately took in the two uniformed men looming over her. Her heart rate spiked as she tried to process what was happening. The officer's lips were moving rapidly, but she couldn't make out what they were saying. Their body language, however, was unmistakably aggressive. "I'm deaf," she said, her voice carrying the slightly different cadence that marked her as someone who had never heard her own speech. She pointed to her ears and then began to sign, her hands moving in the fluid, expressive language that was her primary means of communication. I can't hear you. What's wrong? But the officers interpreted her signing as some kind of gang gesture or deliberate mockery. Officer Hartley had never received training on interacting with deaf individuals, and Officer Webb's understanding of sign language extended only to what he'd seen in movies. To them, her hand movements looked like she was taunting them or signaling to accomplices. "Stop that gang sign nonsense," Webb snapped, grabbing her wrist. "You heard us the first time. Don't play games." Naomi tried to pull away, panic rising in her chest. She looked desperately around the library, hoping someone would intervene or at least understand what was happening. Mrs. Chen, the elderly librarian at the circulation desk, was watching with obvious concern, but seemed frozen by the presence of the officers. Several other patrons had stopped what they were doing to stare, their faces reflecting a mixture of curiosity and discomfort. "Please," Naomi said, her voice rising with stress. "I'm doing homework. I haven't done anything wrong." She gestured toward her laptop screen, hoping they would see her research project and understand that she was just a student trying to complete an assignment. Officer Hartley misread her gestures as resistance. In his mind, she was a disruptive teenager who had escalated to physically threatening behavior. The fact that she was black and in a predominantly white neighborhood library added another layer to his assumptions. He had responded to dozens of calls in this area over the years, and, in his experience, young black individuals were often involved in some kind of criminal activity. "That's enough," he said, reaching for his handcuffs. "You're coming with us. We can do this the easy way or the hard way." Naomi didn't understand why they wanted to arrest her, but she knew enough about police interactions to be terrified. Her parents had given her the talk about how to behave around law enforcement, but those instructions assumed she would be able to hear and respond to verbal commands. The communication barrier was turning a simple misunderstanding into something much more dangerous. When Officer Webb grabbed her arm to pull her away from the computer, Naomi instinctively resisted. She wasn't trying to fight them, but her body's natural response to being grabbed by strangers was to pull away. This resistance was all the justification the officers felt they needed to use force. "She's fighting us," Webb called out, loud enough for everyone in the library to hear. "Suspect is resisting arrest and becoming violent." The situation spiraled out of control within seconds. Naomi found herself being dragged away from her workstation, her laptop and books scattered across the floor. She tried to explain that she was deaf, signing frantically while also attempting to speak. But her panic made her words less clear and her signs more erratic. Other library patrons watched in horror as the officers manhandled the teenager. Mrs. Chen finally found her voice, calling out, "Officers, I think there's been a misunderstanding. She's just a student working on a project." But the officers were already committed to their course of action. In their minds, they were dealing with a non-compliant suspect who had escalated to physical resistance. The fact that she was deaf never registered. Despite her repeated attempts to communicate her disability, as they dragged her toward the library's main entrance, Naomi's terror reached a breaking point. She couldn't understand why this was happening to her, couldn't comprehend how a normal afternoon of research had turned into a nightmare. She tried once more to sign that she was deaf, but Officer Hartley interpreted her hand movements as an attempt to strike him. "Watch it," he growled, tightening his grip on her arm. "Keep your hands where I can see them." The pepper spray came out when they reached the library's front steps. Naomi, overwhelmed and frightened, made one last attempt to break free and return to her research. She twisted away from Officer Webb's grasp, not to escape, but simply to turn around and try to explain what was happening. Her movement, however, was perceived as an aggressive act. "She's going for something," Webb shouted, drawing his pepper spray canister. "Suspect is reaching for a weapon." Naomi wasn't reaching for anything except understanding. Her hands moved in the space between them, forming the signs for please, and help, and deaf. But the officers saw only threatening gestures from a non-compliant suspect. The pepper spray hit her face at point-blank range, the chemical burning through her sinuses and throat. The pain was immediate and overwhelming. Naomi dropped to the concrete steps, her hands clutching at her face as the pepper spray did its work. She couldn't scream for help because she couldn't control her voice through the agony. Couldn't sign for assistance because her hands were busy protecting her burning eyes. Around her, the library erupted in chaos. Patrons who had witnessed the entire incident were shouting at the officers, demanding to know why they had just pepper sprayed a teenager who was clearly not a threat. Mrs. Chen was on the phone with someone, her voice high and urgent. Parents were pulling their children away from the scene, some recording the aftermath with their phones. Officer Hartley, his adrenaline still running high, felt a surge of satisfaction at having controlled the situation. To him, they had just prevented a potentially dangerous encounter with a violent suspect. The fact that the suspect was now writhing on the ground, clearly in distress, only confirmed that they had made the right decision to use force. "That's what happens when you don't comply with police orders," he muttered to his partner, loud enough for the gathering crowd to hear. "Maybe next time she'll think twice before trying to fight us." Officer Webb, however, was beginning to feel the first stirrings of doubt. The teenager on the ground didn't look like a hardened criminal. She looked like exactly what she was, a frightened student who had been doing homework in a library. But he pushed those thoughts aside, focusing instead on justifying their actions. "She was definitely on something," he said, kneeling down to examine Naomi more closely. "Look at how she was moving her hands. Classic signs of drug use or mental illness." As emergency medical services arrived to treat Naomi's pepper spray exposure, Officer Hartley made a decision that would come back to haunt him, still running on adrenaline and convinced that they had just handled a dangerous situation. He pulled out his phone and took a selfie with his partner, both of them standing over Naomi as she received medical attention. He posted the image to his personal social media account with the caption, "Another day keeping our community safe, silencing library loiterers who think they can intimidate honest citizens. Back the blue, law and order, cleaning up the streets." The post went live at 3:47 p.m., just as Naomi was being loaded into an ambulance for treatment of her pepper spray injuries. By 4:15 p.m., it had been shared dozens of times by other officers and their supporters. By 5:00 p.m., it had caught the attention of local civil rights activists who recognized the dangerous implications of celebrating violence against a teenager. But the real turning point came at 5:23 p.m., when Maria Santos, Naomi's certified sign language interpreter, arrived at the library after receiving a frantic call from Mrs. Chen. Maria had been working with Naomi for the past 3 years, helping her navigate academic and social situations where communication barriers might arise. She was also one of the few people who knew about Naomi's family background. Maria rushed into the library carrying a leather portfolio that contained documents most people never saw: diplomatic credentials, embassy identification, and emergency contact information for the United States mission to the United Nations. Because Naomi wasn't just any teenager who happened to be deaf. She was the daughter of Ambassador James Okafor, the U.S. representative to the UN Security Council. The Okafor family had moved to New York 18 months earlier when Ambassador Okafor was appointed to his position. They had deliberately chosen to live in a quiet suburban community rather than in Manhattan, wanting to give their daughter as normal a high school experience as possible. Naomi attended the local public school under her mother's maiden name, Jennings, to avoid the attention and potential security issues that came with being a diplomat's child. Her parents had made the decision to keep her diplomatic status private after consulting with embassy security. They wanted her to be treated like any other American teenager, to make friends based on her personality rather than her father's position, and to navigate the challenges of being deaf in a hearing world without the additional complication of diplomatic protocol. Maria had been specifically instructed to carry the diplomatic credentials only in case of emergencies. Today, qualified as the most serious emergency they had ever encountered. "Where is she?" Maria demanded, rushing to the circulation desk, where Mrs. Chen was still on the phone with emergency services. "Where is Naomi?" Mrs. Chen looked up with obvious relief. "Thank goodness you're here. The police took her to the hospital after they pepper sprayed her. It was terrible. Maria, she was just doing her homework, and they wouldn't listen when we tried to tell them she was deaf." Maria's hands trembled as she opened her portfolio and pulled out her phone. She had 3 calls to make, and each one would change the trajectory of what had happened today. The first call was to Ambassador Okafor's office at the UN. The second was to the embassy's legal attaché. The third was to the State Department's Office of Diplomatic Security. While Maria made her calls, the officers were at the hospital, still convinced that they had handled the situation appropriately. Officer Hartley was actually feeling proud of how they had controlled what could have been a dangerous encounter. He checked his social media post and was pleased to see the positive responses from his fellow officers and supporters. But at 6:15 p.m., everything changed. Maria arrived at the hospital with a full diplomatic security detail and a representative from the Nigerian consulate. Since Naomi held dual citizenship through her father's birth country, she also carried with her something that would prove devastating to the officer's version of event security footage from the embassy's surveillance system, which monitored all vehicles and personnel associated with diplomatic families. The embassy's security cameras had been tracking Naomi's movements as part of standard protective protocols. They had footage of her entering the library at 1:30 p.m. with her school bag and laptop. They had recorded her checking out books and settling down at the computer station. They had captured her peaceful afternoon of research, showing clearly that she had been doing nothing more threatening than typing and taking notes. More importantly, they had recorded the entire incident with the police officers, from multiple angles, in high definition. The footage showed Naomi's obvious attempts to communicate that she was deaf, her peaceful demeanor throughout the encounter, and the officer's escalating aggression toward a teenager who posed no threat to anyone. But the embassy footage was only part of the story. The library's own security cameras had captured everything as well, and Mrs. Chen had already provided that footage to local news outlets. By 7:10 p.m., the story was spreading across social media platforms faster than Officer Hartley's celebratory post had that afternoon. The video showed a young woman peacefully doing homework, completely unaware that police officers were trying to get her attention. It showed her obvious confusion and fear when they grabbed her. It showed her repeated attempts to sign that she was deaf, and their complete failure to recognize or respond appropriately to her disability. And it showed the pepper spray incident in all its unnecessary brutality. The story exploded across news feeds with the force of a digital tsunami. Justice for Naomi began trending within hours. Disability rights advocates, civil rights organizations, and international observers all began sharing the footage and demanding accountability. The image of a young deaf woman being pepper sprayed for doing homework became a symbol of police brutality and systemic failure. At 8:30 p.m., as Naomi was being released from the hospital with her parents by her side, Officer Hartley received a phone call that changed his life forever. His commanding officer was calling to inform him that he and Officer Webb were being placed on immediate administrative leave, pending a full investigation. The celebratory social media post had been screenshots and was now evidence in what would become a federal civil rights case. But the real crisis was just beginning. At 9:00 p.m. that evening, the Westfield Community Center was hosting the annual UN Cultural Exchange Gala, a diplomatic event that brought together ambassadors, dignitaries, and community leaders to celebrate international cooperation and cultural understanding. Ambassador Okafor had been scheduled to deliver the keynote address about building bridges across differences. The venue was the ballroom that the local homeowners association used for their community events. It had been decorated with flags from dozens of countries, and the guest list included representatives from embassies around the world. It was meant to be a celebration of diversity and mutual respect. Instead, it became the stage for one of the most dramatic diplomatic incidents in recent memory. As the ambassadors and dignitaries gathered for the evening's program, news of the afternoon's events was spreading through the diplomatic community. Ambassador Okafor had been at the hospital with his daughter, but his deputy had been in contact with embassy security throughout the evening. The decision was made to proceed with the gala, but with a significant change to the program. At 9:45 p.m., as the assembled diplomats sat down for dinner, the large screens that had been set up to display cultural presentations began showing something entirely different. The library security footage played in its entirety, showing the assault on Ambassador Okafor's daughter from beginning to end. The reaction was immediate and devastating. Gasps and shocked murmurs filled the ballroom as diplomats watched a young woman being brutalized by police for the crime of being deaf and doing homework. Several ambassadors rose from their seats, some making phone calls, others demanding immediate explanations from the American officials present. Ambassador Marie Dubois from France was the first to speak publicly. "This is not just a violation of this young woman's rights," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the silent ballroom. "This is an attack on the principles of human dignity that we claim to uphold in our international community." Ambassador Chen Wei from China followed with his own statement. "How can we trust a nation to protect diplomatic personnel abroad when they cannot protect a diplomat's child in their own community? This incident raises serious questions about America's commitment to the rule of law." The evening that was supposed to celebrate international cooperation had become a diplomatic disaster. Representatives from over 30 countries were demanding answers, and several were already making plans to file formal complaints with the State Department. The incident was no longer just about two police officers making a mistake. It had become an international crisis. At 10:30 p.m., State Department security officers arrived at the hospital, where Naomi was still being treated for her injuries. But they weren't there to investigate the incident further. They were there to arrest Officers Hartley and Webb on federal charges of violating the civil rights of a person with disabilities under color of law. The arrests were made public immediately, partly to contain the diplomatic fallout, and partly because the evidence was so overwhelming that delay would only make the situation worse. The officers were charged with deprivation of rights under color of law, a federal felony that carried potential sentences of life in prison when bodily injury resulted from the violation. Officer Hartley, who had started the day feeling proud of his law enforcement career, found himself in federal custody, facing charges that would end not just his career, but potentially his freedom. The social media post that had seemed like harmless bragging that afternoon was now Exhibit A in a federal hate crime prosecution. Officer Webb, who had been having doubts about their actions since the pepper spray incident, was facing the same charges. His 3-year career in law enforcement was over, and his future depended on his cooperation with federal investigators and his willingness to testify about the training failures and cultural attitudes that had led to the incident. The legal proceedings that followed were swift and decisive. The video evidence was so clear, and the violation of Naomi's rights so obvious, that both officers pled guilty to federal civil rights violations rather than face trial. They were sentenced to 7 years in federal prison and ordered to pay restitution to Naomi for her medical expenses and emotional trauma. But the consequences extended far beyond the two officers involved. The incident triggered a comprehensive review of police training protocols throughout the county, with particular focus on interactions with individuals who have disabilities. New policies were implemented requiring all officers to receive training in basic sign language and disability awareness. The Homeowners Association, which had organized the cultural exchange gala where the diplomatic crisis unfolded, faced their own reckoning. Several members had been vocal supporters of the aggressive policing policies that had led to the incident. They found themselves under intense scrutiny from both the international community and their own neighbors. The association's president, Karen Mitchell, had been one of the most outspoken advocates for law and order in the community. She had frequently complained about teenagers loitering in public spaces and had specifically requested increased police patrols around the library. When the full story of Naomi's assault became public, Karen's own role in creating the climate that led to the incident could not be ignored. Community members began organizing to remove Karen and other association board members who had promoted the hostile attitudes toward young people that had contributed to the tragedy. The international attention on the case meant that their small suburban community was now under global scrutiny, and many residents were embarrassed by the association's role in the incident. The financial consequences for the community were severe. Several diplomatic families who had been considering moving to the area canceled their plans. Property values dropped as the community became associated with police brutality and discrimination. Local businesses lost customers as people avoided the area where that deaf girl was attacked. But perhaps the most significant consequence was the transformation of the community itself. The incident had forced residents to confront their own biases and assumptions about young people, people with disabilities, and people of color. Many had never questioned the aggressive policing policies they had supported until they saw the devastating results. Mrs. Chen, the librarian who had witnessed the entire incident, became an unexpected leader in the community's healing process. She organized a series of public forums where residents could discuss what had happened and how to prevent similar incidents in the future. She also established a fund to support sign language education in the community. The library itself was transformed into a symbol of reconciliation. The computer station where Naomi had been working was designated as a memorial to the importance of protecting everyone's right to equal access to education and public spaces. A plaque was installed reading, "In honor of Naomi Okafor and all students who pursue knowledge despite the barriers they face." 6 months after the incident, Ambassador Okafor returned to the community center for another diplomatic event. But this time, it was to celebrate the opening of the Naomi Okafor International Sign Language Institute, funded jointly by the Homeowners Association and the State Department as part of the settlement of the federal civil rights lawsuit. The institute would provide free sign language classes to community members, train local businesses and organizations in disability accessibility, and serve as a resource for deaf and hard-of-hearing individuals throughout the region. It represented a complete transformation of the community's approach to inclusion and accessibility. Naomi herself had recovered physically from her injuries. Though the emotional trauma took longer to heal, she had completed her senior project on civil rights, earning the highest grade in her class and a scholarship to her dream college. But more importantly, she had found her voice as an advocate for disability rights and police reform. Her testimony before Congress about the need for police training on disability issues led to federal legislation requiring all law enforcement agencies to provide comprehensive disability awareness training. The Naomi's Law mandated that officers receive training in basic sign language, disability recognition, and de-escalation techniques specifically designed for interactions with people who have disabilities. The legislation also established a national database to track incidents involving police and individuals with disabilities, ensuring that what happened to Naomi could be prevented from happening to others. It represented a fundamental shift in how law enforcement approached interactions with vulnerable populations. At the signing ceremony for the legislation, Naomi stood beside the president as he signed the bill into law. She had prepared remarks in both spoken English and American Sign Language, and her message was simple but powerful. No one should be punished for being different. No one should be hurt for being unable to hear. And no one should have to carry diplomatic credentials to be treated with basic human dignity. The ceremony was broadcast live to the United Nations, where ambassadors from around the world watched a young woman who had been pepper sprayed for doing homework become a symbol of resilience and positive change. The incident that had started as a tragic misunderstanding had become a catalyst for meaningful reform. Officer Hartley and Officer Webb, serving their federal sentences, had become cautionary tales in police training academies across the country. Their case was studied as an example of how unconscious bias, inadequate training, and systemic failures could combine to create devastating consequences for both law enforcement officers and the communities they served. The social media post that had celebrated silencing library loiterers was now used in training programs to demonstrate the dangers of celebrating violence and the importance of treating every citizen with respect and dignity. It served as a reminder that in the age of social media and ubiquitous cameras, every police action was potentially subject to global scrutiny. The community that had once supported aggressive policing policies learned to embrace a different approach to public safety. Crime rates didn't increase when police began using de-escalation techniques and treating all residents with respect. Instead, community trust in law enforcement improved, and the area became known as a model for inclusive policing practices. The Cultural Exchange Gala, which had been the scene of such diplomatic crisis, was transformed into an annual celebration of accessibility and inclusion. Each year, the event featured presentations from disability advocates, performances by deaf and hard-of-hearing artists, and recognition of community members who had worked to make the area more inclusive. Naomi attended the gala every year during her college breaks, not as the victim of a tragic incident, but as a celebrated advocate and community leader. She had turned her traumatic experience into a force for positive change, using her platform to educate others and prevent similar incidents from occurring. The laptop that had been destroyed during her arrest was replaced with a new one, provided by the computer company as part of their support for her advocacy work. She used it to continue her research into civil rights and disability advocacy, eventually earning a law degree and following in her father's footsteps as a public servant. Her senior project, the one she had been working on when the incident occurred, was eventually published as a book about the intersection of disability rights and civil rights movements. It became required reading in criminal justice programs across the country, ensuring that future law enforcement officers would learn about the importance of treating all citizens with dignity and respect. The book's dedication read simply, "To Mrs. Chen, who called for help when no one else would speak up, and to all the library workers, teachers, and community members who create safe spaces for learning and growth." 10 years later, Naomi returned to the Westfield Public Library as a federal judge, having been appointed to the bench after a distinguished career as a civil rights attorney. She was there to deliver a lecture on the anniversary of the incident that had changed so many lives. The library had been renovated and expanded, with new accessibility features and technology designed to serve patrons with all types of disabilities. The computer station where she had been working that day was now part of a larger accessibility center that provided resources for students and community members who needed accommodations. As she stood at the podium, looking out at an audience that included law enforcement officers, disability advocates, community leaders, and students, Judge Naomi Okafor Jennings reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The pepper spray that had burned her eyes had ultimately opened the eyes of an entire community to the importance of inclusion and justice. 10 years ago, I was pepper sprayed for doing homework, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the packed auditorium. Today, I stand before you as living proof that our democracy works when we demand it work for everyone. The question is not whether we will face challenges and setbacks in our pursuit of justice. The question is whether we will learn from those challenges and use them to build a better future for all our children. In the audience, Mrs. Chen wiped away tears as she watched the young woman she had tried to help that terrible afternoon deliver a message of hope and reconciliation. The librarian had retired years earlier, but she still came to the library regularly to volunteer and to remember the day when standing up for what was right had helped change the world. The officers who had replaced Hartley and Webb were also in the audience. Having received extensive training in disability awareness and de-escalation techniques, they represented a new generation of law enforcement professionals who understood that protecting and serving meant treating every citizen with dignity and respect, regardless of their ability to hear verbal commands or their age or race. As Judge Okafor Jennings concluded her remarks, the audience rose in a standing ovation that she felt through the vibrations in the floor. She had found her voice in the silence that had once endangered her, and that voice had become a powerful force for justice and change. The journey from victim to advocate to judge had not been easy, but it had been necessary. The pepper spray that had burned her face had ultimately illuminated the path toward a more just and inclusive society. And in the end, that was perhaps the most powerful lesson of all, even in our darkest moments. We have the power to create light for others who will follow behind us. The silent scream that had echoed through the library that day had become a clarion call for justice that would resonate for generations to come.